No one remembered when the mailbox first appeared. It stood rusted and leaning near the edge of Algonquin Park, where a school camp once stood. The land was being cleared for a resort. A worker noticed it, partly buried in soil. It was sealed, no address, no path leading to it. Inside were letters, dozens. The paper was old, the handwriting small, uneven, like a child's. One envelope had no name, no stamp, just 4 words, written in what looked like dried blood. "We're still here." Police arrived. Reporters followed. Some dismissed it. Others remembered. 18 years ago, a 5th grade class vanished during a school trip. No bodies. No trace. Just a locked tent beside a silent lake. The story made headlines, then disappeared. But the handwriting was real, and the message was clear. So who left the letters? And how had they stayed hidden for so long? Helen Murray was 52, once a 5th grade teacher at Maple Grove Elementary. She lived alone now, in a quiet corner of southern Ontario, in a house that creaked at night and smelled faintly of pine. The locals rarely saw her. Most had stopped trying. Years ago, they used to whisper when she passed by. "That's the one, the teacher from the missing class." She had not taught since 2005. That was the year her entire class vanished on a school trip to Algonquin Park. The bus never came back. A locked tent was found by the lake. No children, no driver, no trace. Helen never married. She said she didn't deserve a family of her own. She still kept the old class photo in her wallet, tucked behind her ID, creased along the edges, worn from years of trembling fingers. In that picture, 17 children smiled under spring sunlight, some missing teeth, all full of life. Helen stood behind them, hands folded, eyes gentle. Every year, on June 3rd, she returned to the woods alone. She'd stand at the edge of the lake, with a candle in hand, even in the rain, even when no one else remembered. She never spoke during these visits. She just watched the water and listened for anything, a whisper, a ripple, a voice that might return to her. Sometimes she heard things, leaves shifting, a faint splash. But she never told anyone. They already thought she was fragile. She couldn't give them another reason to say she'd lost her mind. Guilt lived in her bones. "I should have been there," she whispered often. The trip had been planned for weeks, but she'd fallen ill the night before. A substitute had taken her place. Helen had begged the principal to delay it. No one listened, and the next day they were gone. All she had left were letters, childlike handwriting, warm words of thanks from her students. She read them when the night stretched too long, when the wind moaned through her window, when she could almost hear footsteps in the hall. One said, "Ms. Murray, thank you for helping me believe I'm smart." Another, "I hope I never lose you." For years, Helen waited, not for an answer, but for something, anything, to break the silence. Then came the call. A rusted mailbox had been found during land clearing near the old campgrounds. Inside were letters, dozens of them, postmarked with no date, written in small, hurried scrawl, all unsigned. But one had a phrase that nearly made her heart stop beating. "We're still here." Helen stood frozen, hand gripping the phone, eyes wide with a mix of terror and longing. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't felt that alive, or that afraid in years. That night, she packed a small bag, tucked the photo back into her wallet, and whispered a quiet prayer. "If they're still there, let me find them." She stepped outside into the rain, and for the first time in 18 years, she turned back toward the forest. The road leading to the old campground was narrower than Helen remembered. Weeds brushed against the side of her car. Birds scattered from the low trees as her tires crunched over gravel. The sky above was heavy, the kind of gray that made colors disappear. As she stepped out, the air smelled of pine needles and wet earth, faintly metallic, like rusted memory. The mailbox stood crooked near a cluster of tree stumps, sealed in yellow tape. A small wooden stake marked its location, like a forgotten grave. Helen stepped closer, her breath caught. One of the envelopes had slipped halfway out of the slot, its corner soaked by last night's rain. It was pale yellow, the kind children might use for birthday cards. Her hand trembled as she reached toward it, but stopped. She didn't need to touch it. She knew the handwriting. Neat but uneven, small curls on every E. Emma. It was Emma's handwriting, her brightest student, the one who used to hum softly when she worked, who wore purple socks every Tuesday, who once said she wanted to become a veterinarian, but only for rabbits. Helen's knees weakened. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She stepped back and covered her mouth, eyes wide. She wasn't ready. She had never truly been ready. A voice behind her broke the silence. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Helen turned. A young officer, barely 30, stood a few feet away. His uniform was clean, his tone polite but detached. She pointed at the mailbox, her voice tight. "Who found this?" He shrugged. "Construction crew. They were clearing the land for a retreat center. Found it buried behind some brush." Helen took a breath. The writing. That envelope. That's one of my students. Her name was Emma. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, it's probably a prank. Teenagers with too much time. Those kids have been gone a long time." Something in her snapped, but her voice remained steady. No one outside that classroom knew Emma's nickname. She used it right there, on that envelope. "That's her." The officer hesitated. Then he looked away. "We'll file a report." Helen felt a cold wave roll through her body. She stepped away from the mailbox. Her fingers were still trembling. A man nearby, standing with a camera around his neck, spoke without turning. "I walk these woods often. I live just up the road. Sometimes I hear children laughing. At night. Not coyotes, not echoes' laughter." Helen turned toward him. His voice was tired, worn down by doubt. "I thought it was my mind playing tricks," he said. "But now I'm not so sure." The wind picked up. The trees creaked. A leaf brushed her cheek, and she thought for a moment she heard her own name, Miss Murray, like a memory whispered back from the dark. She closed her eyes. She saw them again. 17 faces. The way they laughed when it started to rain. The way they zipped their jackets. The way Emma always ran ahead to find wildflowers. They weren't just gone. They were waiting. Something inside her shifted. That old familiar ache, guilt, sorrow, longing rose again. But this time it came with something else, purpose. She opened her eyes and looked at the trees. Somewhere out there was a piece of the truth. She couldn't walk away. Not now, not again. She turned back toward her car and whispered to herself, "I'm staying." Helen returned to the ruins of Maple Grove Elementary, the school where she once stood at the front of the classroom, pointer in hand, sunlight on the blackboard, 17 faces looking back at her. Now the building was gone. A gravel lot replaced it. Weeds growing where children used to run. The wind moved through the chain-link fence, making it rattle like distant laughter. Only the old flagpole remained, bent, rusted, still reaching. She went to the town archive office and requested the school's original student records. They gave her a thin file, mostly attendance lists, some permission slips, a single copy of the final yearbook. Page after page, she saw their faces, smiling in photographs, names typed neatly underneath. Emma Collins, Jonah Lee, Tyler Bryant. Each name hit like a knock on a locked door. She copied the list and folded it into her coat pocket. She drove for hours, stopping at houses that once belonged to her students. Most had new owners, or no one answered at all. One woman, standing in a bathrobe on a front porch, listened for a while, then closed the door gently. Another shook her head, said, "It's too long ago, best to let it lie." A man with deep lines on his face muttered, "I don't talk about that day." They all looked tired, like people who had mourned too long and grown numb. At the town library, she pulled down dusty boxes from the back shelf. Newspapers from June 2005, headlines yellowed with age. The day after the disappearance, one article called it a mysterious accident. Another hinted at a forest animal attack. None of them had answers. None of them mentioned the locked tent, or the missing driver, or the voices some claimed to have heard in the trees. Helen stared at the pages, her fingers smudged with old ink. The truth, it seemed, had been swallowed with the dust. She visited the police station, a gray building with one light flickering in the lobby. She asked for the case files, even just a summary. The woman behind the desk didn't look up. "All stored," she said. "Nothing here anymore." Her voice was flat, rehearsed, the kind of voice that avoids the past like a sickness. Helen turned to leave, but a younger officer, sitting nearby, glanced at her with quiet eyes. A few minutes later, he followed her to the parking lot and handed her a folded sheet. "Map of the campground," he whispered, and a note at the bottom, handwritten in pencil. "Ranger Station 12, abandoned since the incident." Helen gripped the paper tightly. Her hands were cold. Her breath left a cloud on the windshield as she sat behind the wheel. She drove toward the park, the roads narrowing, the sky darkening with low clouds. The station was hard to find, buried behind brush and moss, the path overgrown. Only the roof was visible under a mess of pine branches. She stepped out, her boots sinking into soft earth. The rain had turned to a cold mist, clinging to her coat. She reached the door, once painted red, now gray with rot. Her hand hovered over the wood. It crumbled slightly under her touch. She opened it slowly. The hinges groaned. Inside, it smelled of mildew and ash. Broken shelves. A chair tipped over. A lantern cracked in half. Helen stepped inside, water dripping from her coat. Her hand brushed against the wall, and for a moment she paused. Someone had carved initials into the beam, small, uneven. E.C. Emma Collins. Her eyes burned. She swallowed. The room was quiet, except for the sound of rain on the tin roof. She stood in the center of it all, still as stone, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not grief. Presence. Someone had been here, long after the world stopped looking. But no one answered when she spoke. The station gave no voice back. She returned to her car in the dark, soaked to the skin, her boots heavy with mud. Behind her, the trees closed in, and the truth stayed hidden. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky was still heavy, the air damp and still. Helen returned to the old clearing, her coat still wet from the night before, her boots caked with dried mud. She moved slowly, eyes scanning the ground, hands in her pockets, shoulders tense. Something pulled at her, like a voice in the wind that hadn't finished speaking. Near the mailbox, the grass was pressed down, the tape flapping in the breeze. A few feet away, caught in the edge of a low bush, she saw it, a pale envelope torn, edges dark with dirt, its corners still fluttering slightly. She bent down, brushed it off carefully, her fingers cold and stiff. The paper was damp, but the ink was still there. She opened it gently, unfolded the note, her eyes narrowing. The handwriting was familiar, shaky but precise, the way children write when they're trying to make something last. The message was short. "Don't forget the lantern. The path ends under the red rock." Helen froze. The words echoed in her chest, not because of what they said, but because of who might have written them. This wasn't random, not a stranger, not a prank. It was something only the children would remember. There had been a game, a long time ago, a campfire game, the night before the trip ended. She had hidden a tin box of candy under a large red rock near the lake, told the students to find it using clues. Their laughter had echoed through the trees. Emma was the one who had found it. She had jumped up and shouted, "I knew it! I knew it! You always hide things near the trees." Helen folded the note, her hand shaking, her chest tight. It wasn't just a memory, it was a direction. Someone had left it for her, or for someone, knowing it would be understood. She turned toward the lake. The trail was overgrown, branches bent low, ferns brushing her knees. The ground was soft beneath her feet. Birds stirred in the trees, but the woods were quiet, too quiet. At the edge of the clearing, she saw it, the red rock, weathered, mossy, but still visible, tucked beneath a slope covered in tangled roots and weeds. Helen dropped to her knees, her jeans soaked through instantly. She pulled at the weeds, hands dirty, nails cracking. The soil was loose, disturbed. Beneath it, something hard resisted, a wooden surface, flat, damp. She dug further. It was a door, small, made of thick planks, old metal hinges rusted, a faded handle stuck to one side. She tried pulling it. It didn't move. She leaned close, her cheek brushing the damp wood, ear pressed to the surface. For a second, there was nothing. Then she thought she heard it. The faintest sound. Breathing, maybe. A soft shifting, like someone moving just beyond the door. She jumped back, heart pounding, eyes wide. Her voice came out hoarse. "Hello," she whispered. "Is someone there?" No reply. Just wind in the trees. Just the sound of her own breath. She called the police. A different officer this time. She explained everything. The note, the rock, the hidden door. He listened for a while, then sighed. "Ma'am, there's nothing on record about underground shelters out there. That part of the park was never used for storage or buildings. Probably just some old root cellar. You're overthinking." She insisted, begged him to send someone. He said they'd make a note, but no promises. Helen stood in the woods, alone again. Her coat soaked at the sleeves, her hands scratched and stained. The red rock behind her. The wind blew gently through the trees. She looked back once, then turned and began to walk. She didn't go home. She went back to the ranger station. The door was still broken, the inside still cold. She moved slowly, searching. In the back corner, behind a pile of rotted wood, she found something. A small cabinet, locked but loose. She pried it open. Inside was a map, yellowed, fragile, and something else, a key tied to a piece of cloth. Her fingers brushed the fabric. It was purple, faded, soft, the same color Emma used to wear around her wrist. Helen sat down on the floor, the map on her lap, the key in her hand. Someone had been waiting to be found. The ground was wet again, soft beneath Helen's boots as she returned to the red rock. The sky above was pale, washed out, no sun, just a quiet gray that blurred the edges of the trees. She carried a rusted shovel in one hand, a garden trowel in the other. The key and map were tucked into her jacket, close to her chest. She knelt beside the rock, the same way Emma had all those years ago, knees pressing into the cold earth, fingers brushing away moss and roots like layers of sleep. She started digging. The soil gave way easier than she expected. Damp, loose, like it had been disturbed before. Her breaths came sharp, fogging the air. Her hands moved quickly, pulling back twigs, stones, patches of moss. Then she hit something solid. Wood. Flat. Smooth beneath her fingertips. She cleared the rest with shaking hands. The hatch was real. Weathered planks, thick iron hinges, a rusted lock buried into the frame. She sat back, pulled the folded paper from her pocket, stared at the numbers written by a hand long gone. 8257. She leaned forward, brushed the dirt from the metal dial, and turned it slowly. 8257. Her fingers paused, and then she twisted the latch. A soft click broke the silence. The door creaked open half an inch, pushed by a breath of cold air that rose from below. Helen flinched. The scent was sharp, damp, like mold and stone and years of being forgotten. She reached for her flashlight, clicked it on. The beam cut into the dark. She stepped down slowly. Each rung of the ladder groaned beneath her weight. The space below was narrow, tight, the air pressed close. Her light swept across the walls. Old mattresses lined the edges, their fabric stained and torn. A pile of empty cans sat in the corner, labels peeled away by time. Along one wall, she saw blankets, faded blue and green, folded with care. In the far corner, something small lay in the dust. She stepped closer, the beam of light trembling in her hand. It was a shoe. A child's shoe. Pink, covered in a thick layer of dust. Still upright, as if someone had taken it off and never returned. Helen's chest tightened. She knelt beside it, reached out. Her fingers hovered above the fabric. She didn't touch it. She couldn't. Her light moved again, and it caught the wall. Crayon drawings, faint but still there, scattered across the concrete like whispers. A house. A sun with a smile. A tree with red circles for apples. Small hands had made them, years ago, with hope. And then, in the corner, taped to the wall, something that stopped her breath. A photo. Her class photo. The original. Not a copy, not a replica. The one she remembered taking that spring morning, when the grass was still wet and the sky still blue. The children stood in rows, some squinting, some grinning. She was behind them, her arms folded, her eyes tired but kind. Beneath it, in messy handwriting, one sentence. We're still waiting. Helen sank to her knees. The flashlight dropped, rolling a few feet, its light spinning across the floor. Her hands covered her mouth, her shoulders trembled. She felt the past crash into the present. everything folding in on itself. That picture had been in her drawer, in her desk, before the trip. How did it end up here? Who brought it? Who left that message? The ground was quiet, the air still. But something shifted in her ears, barely audible. A breath. A movement. A sound not made by her. She turned her head slowly. The beam of the flashlight settled near the back of the room. A shape. Small. Watching. She wasn't alone. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Her fingers gripped the wall behind her, the cold cement grounding her to this moment. The darkness was thick, but she felt it now. Presence. Quiet, like someone who had waited too long to speak. She whispered, barely more than breath, "Is someone there?" Silence. Then a sound. Not a word, not quite. A shuffle. A soft scrape. She turned fully, the flashlight steady again. There was nothing in sight, but the shoe had moved. Helen stood in the damp dark, her breath shallow, her ears straining. The air pressed close, the silence too still. Then it came, a soft rustling, faint, like bare feet brushing sand. She turned slightly. The flashlight held steady, the beam slicing through dust. Her heart thudded in her chest, her mouth dry. She took a breath. "Emma," she whispered. "It's me, Miss Murray, I'm here." Her voice cracked. The name felt sacred. She waited, blinking into the black. Nothing. No sound. But something was there. A presence. She felt it. Eyes on her, not cruel, not threatening, but watching. Careful. Silent. Then, from the darkness, something touched her. A hand, small, cold, pressed lightly against her wrist. Just for a second. Then gone. Helen gasped, turned sharply, light darting across stone and dust. No one there. The hand had vanished, but her skin still burned where it had touched her. She didn't run. She stepped forward. Her legs shook, but she walked deeper into the shelter. Her voice broke again. "Are you still alive? Please, say something." Her tears came fast, falling warm down her cheeks. Her flashlight flickered. She stopped and reached for the wall, fingers gripping rough cement. "I'm here," she whispered again, voice trembling. "I never stopped looking. You're not forgotten." Minutes passed. Nothing moved. The air was heavy, holding its breath. Then, something shifted behind her. A soft exhale, not hers. She turned again, heart racing. But the space was empty. She climbed the ladder slowly, each rung slick with age. When she stepped out, the wind hit her face, sharp and cold. The trees around her whispered. She blinked in the gray light, her eyes adjusting. Then a voice cut through the air. "You shouldn't be here." Helen spun around. A man stood at the edge of the clearing. He was tall, in his late 50s, face lined, jacket zipped up to his neck. He stepped closer, boots silent on wet earth. His voice was calm, but firm. "This is private land, part of the new conservation project. You're trespassing." Helen held her ground. Her hair was damp, her hands dirty. "I'm looking for the truth," she said, her voice steady now. "There are children down there." There were. He didn't blink. "You're mistaken. That site's been sealed off for decades. No one has lived there. You need to leave." She narrowed her eyes. "Who are you? What is this place really?" He pulled a badge from his coat. "Site coordinator," he said. "Wildlife management. You'll need to go." She backed away slowly, turned toward the trail, the red rock at her side. The man watched her leave, his expression unreadable. She felt his gaze on her back, the whole walk down the slope. That night, it rained again. A quiet storm, gentle but persistent. Helen made tea, set her flashlight on the counter, pulled out the documents from her bag. The map, the photos, the note, the key. She laid them out carefully. Then she noticed the latch on her kitchen window. It was open. She froze. Her bag, left by the door, was unzipped. The envelope that held the map was empty. The old key was gone. She ran to her desk, opened the drawers. The folder with the children's names. Missing. The copy of the shelter blueprints. Gone. The photo from the wall. Disappeared. She searched the entire house. Nothing else was touched. No drawers rifled, no footprints, no mess. Just the things that mattered. The silence was loud. A kind of silence that hummed. Helen stood in the center of her living room, drenched in fear. Not fear of ghosts or shadows, but of men, of people who knew what she'd found and wanted it buried again. She sat down slowly, hands trembling in her lap. Someone had come for the truth, not to uncover it, but to erase it. She looked at the door, then at the window, then back at her empty hands. In a small voice, she whispered, "They're still watching." Helen drove to the cafe the next morning, her hands tight around the wheel, hoping to find Willard seated at his usual table, hands curled around a chipped mug. But the booth was empty. The waitress hadn't seen him. He hadn't come in. She asked around the neighborhood. No one had. His trailer was locked, the curtains drawn, the truck gone, his name already fading, like a note left out in the rain. She stood on the sidewalk, staring at the closed cafe door, her heart thudding with something colder than fear. It was erasure, a slow, deliberate kind. She could feel it now, the past being folded up, hidden piece by piece. That night, unable to sleep, she sat at her kitchen table and flipped through her old records, school files, class rosters, every note she had kept over the years. Then something rose from memory. Emma had a brother, a twin, Elliot. He had been quiet, reserved, always following a few steps behind his sister, often wearing mismatched socks. He had drawn maps on the back of worksheets, tunnels, ladders, secret doors. Helen searched for their last known address, tracked the family to a town near Quebec. It took 3 phone calls and a long drive through snow-dusted roads to find the house. The woman who opened the door was older now, hair gray, eyes tired, but her face still held the shape of someone who had once waited too long for hope. The moment Helen said her name, the woman stepped aside and whispered, "I thought this day might come." They sat in silence for a while, warm mugs between their hands, the smell of old wood and wool blankets thick in the air. Then the woman reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope, faded, edges soft from years of being handled. "It came in 2007, she said. "No return address, no stamp. Just this." Helen opened the letter slowly. The handwriting was careful, still young, but unmistakably sincere. The ink had bled in places, but the words were clear. "We made a new home. Elliot keeps the fire going." Helen pressed the paper to her chest. Her fingers trembled. It wasn't a lie. It had never been a lie. Back home, she laid the old map out on her living room floor, smoothed the creases. She traced every line, every tunnel, every corner. Then she saw it. A faint mark, faded in the fold. A side tunnel, barely noted. It branched from the main shelter and curved toward the ranger station. She remembered the note scribbled in pencil. Lock code 8257. But the map showed something else too. A label near the end of the tunnel. Collapsed 1999. She packed her bag before dawn, returned to the forest, her flashlight tucked into her coat, her boots damp with dew. The ranger station stood still under a gray sky, its roof bowed, its windows black. She walked around the back, where the earth dipped, where the ground seemed softer. She searched beneath the fallen leaves, dragging her foot gently over the moss. Then her boots sank slightly. She knelt, brushed away the mulch. A patch of wood, a flat panel, nearly buried. She pried it up. A narrow hole beneath, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. The air was damp, the passage low. She moved carefully, her elbows against the dirt, the flashlight beam narrow and shaking. The tunnel felt forgotten, untouched, yet familiar, like a thought half-remembered in sleep. At the end, the tunnel opened into a room. Small, cracked walls, a low ceiling, the smell of stone and smoke, blankets in a pile, a lantern on the ground, and sitting on a stool, in the center, was a young man. He looked up. His face was thin, pale, his eyes wide but calm. Brown hair, longer now, cheeks hollow. But the eyes. Helen knew those eyes. Elliot. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at her, quiet, steady, like someone watching a storm finally pass. Then, with a voice dry from years of silence, he said, "We never left. We waited." Helen's hand flew to her mouth. Her knees weakened. The flashlight dropped to the floor. She had found him, and the world would never be the same. Helen couldn't speak. Her throat tightened. Her chest swelled. Her eyes filled with tears. She took one shaky step forward. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Elliot, was it you? Did you write the letters?" He nodded once, slow, deliberate. His eyes didn't leave hers. His voice was soft, steady, like it had waited years for this moment. "We survived," he said, but no one believed. Everyone thought we were dead, so we stayed hidden. It felt safer that way. Helen dropped to her knees. Her hands trembled as she reached for his. She couldn't believe it, but she also never doubted. Not truly. Not in her heart. "Tell me everything," she said. Elliot took a breath. After the accident, the bus slid off the road near the lake, tipped sideways, landed hard. The driver climbed out, left bleeding, didn't look back. We waited, scared, cold. Some cried. Some screamed. We thought someone would come. They never did. A few of us got out through the back window, ran through the woods, found the old hatch. We had gone down there once, for fun, during a campfire game. We remembered the way. It became our shelter. We lived off what we found. Canned food, rainwater, old emergency supplies. We stayed quiet. We didn't know who to trust. And then, one night, we heard someone above us. Adult voices. But not kind. Not searching. Helen's jaw clenched. She leaned in. Who were they? Elliot looked down. Park officials. Or someone else. They saw the hatch. They knew we were there. But they walked away. Didn't say a word. We heard one of them say, "If this gets out, we're finished." Helen's heart sank. Her hands curled into fists. So they covered it up. "Yes," Elliot said quietly. The police stopped looking. The case went cold. And we stayed. Helen wiped her face. She couldn't breathe. Her voice was hoarse. "But why didn't you come out later? Why not run?" "We tried," Elliot said. "I sent letters. Once a year. I put them in mailboxes, under doors. But no one answered. Not one reply. We thought the world didn't want us anymore." Helen shook her head. "No," she said. "They didn't know what to believe. But they will now." She reached into her coat, pulled out her phone, hands shaking. She turned on the camera. Elliot blinked into the lens, confused. Helen steadied it. "Just talk," she said. "Tell them what you told me. Look at the world, not the walls." The first few words came slow, unsure. But then Elliot's voice grew stronger. He told everything. The crash. The shelter. The nights without stars. The drawings on the wall. The voices above. The silence. The years. Helen listened, holding her breath, her fingers cold against the screen. When he finished, she stopped recording. Her voice was steady now. "You're not hiding anymore. You're not lost." They crawled out together, the tunnel behind them closing like a chapter. The trees above rustled, pale light cutting through the clouds. She drove him straight to a nearby town, to the only motel still open in winter. She called a reporter she trusted, one who didn't chase ghosts but followed facts. Within hours, the footage was live. By nightfall, the story had broken. A teacher and a missing student. A shelter in the woods. A hidden truth. The video flooded every news channel. People watched in silence. Mothers cried. Fathers stood still. The nation listened. Helen's phone buzzed without stopping. Reporters. Law enforcement. Former students. Strangers. Survivors. But she turned it off. She sat in the motel hallway, coat draped over her knees, head resting against the wall. Elliot was sleeping inside. For the first time in 18 years, not underground. Not afraid. She stared at the ceiling. Outside, rain hit the window. Gentle, steady. She remembered Emma's voice once saying, "Rain sounds different when you're safe." Helen closed her eyes. Some things need to be seen to be believed. Some children are never truly lost. They're just waiting for someone to look again. The story broke before sunrise. News anchors spoke in measured tones. A name once forgotten now filled every screen. Elliot Collins. Found alive. Missing for 18 years. The shelter beneath Algonquin Park. A video. A voice. A truth no one had imagined, now impossible to ignore. Within hours, flights were booked. Parents who had buried hope now reached for it again. One of them was Emma's mother. Her hand shook as she boarded the plane. In her purse, folded tight, was a photo of Emma in first grade, holding a rabbit made of paper. By noon, the clearing near the Red Rock was no longer quiet. Police cars lined the trail. Emergency teams, social workers, investigators, all gathered under the trees. Helen stood beside Elliot, her hand on his shoulder. The air was cold, but her chest was warm with something she couldn't name. Elliot guided them back, each step careful, each word soft. The hatch creaked open, the ladder groaned, and the light fell inside for the first time in years. They entered together. The stillness broke. 5 children emerged from the dark. They were thin, pale, eyes wide and blinking in the sudden brightness. They moved slowly, unsure, but they were standing, alive, whole. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. From the edge of the crowd, a woman screamed, "Emma!" The name sliced through the air like a bell. One of the children stopped. A girl with tangled hair, cheeks sunken, her eyes filled with tears. She turned, stepped forward. Her knees shook. Then she ran, arms outstretched, crying now. Her voice cracked as she called Mom. The two collided in the middle of the clearing. They held each other so tight, it looked like they might never let go. They sank to the ground, faces buried into each other's necks, shaking with sobs. The others followed. More parents, more names, tears, breathless laughter, the kind that only comes after long silence. Helen watched from a few steps back. She didn't move. Her fingers covered her mouth. The sound of reunion filled the woods. Raw, human, beautiful. One small voice rose above the rest. A boy, no older than 12, stepped forward. "Miss Murray, is that really you?" Helen nodded, tears spilling down her face. She dropped to her knees, opened her arms. They came to her like rain, one by one, small arms wrapping around her. She closed her eyes, held them tight. Her body trembled. For a moment, it felt like spring again. The classroom filled with voices, the smell of markers, the hum of fluorescent lights. This wasn't memory. It was real. The past had returned, not to haunt, but to be held. Somewhere behind her, voices barked orders. 2 men in dark jackets were being led away in handcuffs. Former officials. One had once called off the search. The other had buried the evidence. Cameras followed them, but the forest didn't care. Helen didn't turn to look. She stayed with the children. Later that evening, the sun dipped low across the lake. The trees glowed gold. The water shimmered like glass. Helen stood alone by the shore. Her coat fluttered in the breeze. The air smelled like pine and wet leaves. She watched the reflection of the sky and let the silence settle. She could still hear their voices behind her. Laughter. Soft music from a radio. The world was beginning to spin again, but gentler now. Her eyes drifted toward the center of the lake, where mist curled just above the surface. She thought of the years that had passed. The nights she had sat by the phone. The mornings she woke to silence. The notes she had never sent. The prayers she had whispered into a room no one else entered. She closed her eyes, whispered back, "You were never gone. You were just waiting to be heard." And this time, someone listened. 2 months later, Helen stood in a new home. Smaller, quieter, tucked near a forest edge, far from the road, far from the weight of old keys and silent rooms. She had sold her house, donated her old files, packed only what mattered. The rest, she let go. The walls here were light blue. The windows opened wide. At night, she left them cracked, even in winter, to hear the wind. Sometimes it carried laughter, or maybe just memories pretending to stay. She was in therapy now. Once a week. The counselor was kind, patient. They never rushed the silence. Helen talked about the children, the way they still reached for her hand, even in sleep. She said, healing isn't a light switch, it's a slow sunrise. She was learning how to let joy stay, even when guilt knocked at the door. Elliot wrote letters, long ones. He liked paper more than screens. He lived with a foster family now, was thinking about becoming a teacher. He said, the best people are the ones who stay when it gets quiet. Helen kept his letters in a drawer by her bed. She never read them at once, just a few lines at a time, like prayers. The other children were recovering too. They had therapy, warm meals, blankets with names stitched into the seams. For the first time in years, someone tucked them in. Helen often returned to the lake, not to search, but to sit. She brought a chair, a book, sometimes nothing at all, just the sound of water and wind. She watched the trees shift. She watched the light move across the sky. One day, she found a ribbon tied to a branch near the trail. Purple, faded, Emma's favorite color. It swayed gently in the breeze. Helen smiled. Not every goodbye is final, she thought. Some just take longer to reach the end. She stood there, hand to her heart, and whispered, "They're home now." Then she turned and walked down the path. Because some stories don't end. They echo. If this story moved you, comment below, share your thoughts, subscribe to stay close, and don't forget to like. Someone out there might still be waiting to be heard.